Why, hello there, old sports. Throughout the kingdom of Hallownest, many bugs, beasts, and even gods have suffered greatly. Various beings throughout the universe have lost much to things out of their control. Common bugs lost both their loved ones and their lives to the infection. Some lost their own minds and their memories. Some have been forgotten and left behind by those who were supposed to support them. Even before the plague spread throughout the kingdom, the establishment of Hallownest hurt many, and even almost killed a god in a process. Even outside of Hallownest, groups like the God-Seekers lost their purpose along with their deities, and the Grim Troop remained enslaved to a god beyond their understanding. But near the top of the world, locked away for the ages in the dark, the Hollow Knight remains, fighting, struggling, and suffering, all for a pointless agenda. The Hollow Knight never got a chance to have a life, or make its own choices. It was never even given a name, just a title or two. The two titles we know of for it are the Hollow Knight and the Pure Vessel, often just shortened to the Vessel. But for this video, for convenience sake, and because I want to show this fictional character a little respect, I will be calling it the widely used fan name of Hollow, because I think it sounds cute. I will also be using they/them pronouns for Hollow and all the other vessels going forward, because while they are all canonically genderless, the people who tend to refer to them as it in the game tend to only see the vessels as tools, and part of this video is to explain to you why they are not. If you did not know, Hollow and their siblings were made by the monarch of Hallownest, the Pale King, in an attempt to stop the infection that was ravaging the kingdom. The Pale King's plan involved having eggs created by him and the Queen being dropped into the Abyss Lake at the bottom of the world, where they would then be hollowed out and turned into a void creature. The intention here is that if the heart of the infection was sealed within a mindless creature, the light could be snuffed out by the darkness within. According to the Pale King, there were certain aspects that made a vessel truly hollow. No mind to think, no will to break, no voice to cry suffering. A will, a mind, and a voice are all things that one would assume a sentient creature would have. So, if one didn't have all those things, that takes away a lot of what makes them sentient, a way to express themselves, their own thoughts, their own desires, all of that. If it wasn't there, maybe the light couldn't take hold. But there was a flaw in the plan. Unlike the mindless golems that were created by placing void within an empty shell and imprinting it with simple orders like the wings molds or king's molds, the vessels were created from already living creatures. The eggs that were dropped into the Black Lake would have been the children of the Pale King and White Lady. But as the void killed the children within the eggs, it was imprinted with their will and minds. So, in reality, the vessels weren't mindless at all, but they were ghosts, as Hornet puts it, of those dead children, reincarnated by the void. This is a point I want to dwell on before continuing, that being that the vessels are alive in a sense. At least to me, it's a little confusing to wrap my head around, but the vessels literally aren't the children of the Pale King and White Lady. They are instead the void mimicking the will, instincts, and desires of those dead children, inhabiting what is left of their bodies. So while these new creatures aren't those kids, they've grown into something and someone else given enough time. Just like any developing being, they can grow and develop their own wants and desires beyond just basic survival instinct. We see with creatures like the Collector that beings made entirely of void can develop sentience and dreams. While the Collector does not give off soul when struck because its body contains none, and it's not animated by it, it can be hit with the dream nail to harvest soul from its thoughts and dreams. So, even if it takes time, void beings can develop sentience if allowed to grow and develop freely. All that being said, what was about to happen to these newly created void beings was anything but that. Even the term, vessels, is kind of misleading and objectifying, and obviously that's the point. While the Pale King and White Lady are evil, They had to justify and downplay what they were doing to what are undeniably sentient creatures. So, by calling them vessels and comparing them to objects, it's easier to have a degree of separation and justify what they went on to do to them. If a vessel was able to crawl out of their egg, they were expected to climb up out of a pile of their corpses of their siblings. From there, they have to try to crawl and climb to the top of the abyss chasm, or die in the process. As our player character, who I will call Ghost, witnesses during their climb, many vessels tried to ascend to their father, but ended up falling back down for any number of reasons. But one vessel managed to beat the odds and reach the top where their father awaited them. Hollow was that vessel. But as the young Hollow walked forward to follow its father out of the abyss, they looked back to see Ghost clinging onto the platform. Obviously, we aren't able to know their thoughts at that moment, but many have speculated. Did Hollow feel any sympathy for their sibling? Pity? Concern? Apathy? Regardless, Hollow continued forwards and followed their father out of their birthplace, leaving Ghost to fall back into the dark. From there, we aren't exactly sure how the rest of Hollow's childhood went, but we do know some things, and can assume others. The nursery hidden away in the White Palace was presumably where Hollow was raised for some time, but then again, the fact the room was hidden away may imply it was never used. The journal entry for the pure vessel states Hollow was raised and trained to prime form. Due to the unique nature of the vessel's creation, the process of how they grow might be complicated. The only other vessel we see that is a different size than the normal size is the broken vessel, who seems to be in an in-between stage of growth between a normal vessel and someone like the Hollow Knight. Regardless of how, Hollow did grow, and was taught to use a nail and spells. Due to the Pale King being, well, the king, he was probably able to get the greatest warriors of the era to train Hollow, but I'd assume that Hollow's ability to use soul came from the worm himself. While we never see the Pale King use magic directly, we know he could at least create or manipulate soul totems, and could create various seals for different purposes. So I feel like the most reasonable assumption to make here is that Hollow learned how to use spells from the Pale King. We can see that in the Pure Vessel fight in Godhome, that in their prime, Hollow was an absolutely terrifying opponent to be up against. But you might be wondering why Hollow was trained to fight so much if the Pale King only intended to use them as a glorified cup. The simple, and most likely answer, is just that the Pale King wanted Hollow to defend themselves in case something really bad happened in a worst-case scenario. But personally, considering all the effort that went into locking them up, who the hell did the Pale King expect to try to kill Hollow? No, seriously, he thought all the vessels in the abyss were gone, he just tried to lock them all away, but it doesn't matter. Regardless, Hollow was trained to defend itself, but something I do want to bring up is the void that made up Hollow in the first place. In the Pure Vessel fight, they only used one void-based attack, and they really only use it as a desperation move when they get close to defeat or death. Now, this is just speculation, I will admit, but I feel like it would make sense if the Pale King tried to suppress the void within Hollow, or compelled them to deny that part of themselves. Even if he was willing to use the void against the radiance, the void was very much also opposed to the Pale King and his light. Since we know the Pale King and White Lady didn't see Hollow and the other vessels as living creatures, I wouldn't be surprised if he just assumed they would mindlessly attack him if given the chance. If the void wasn't suppressed, of course. But we can assume Hollow did love their father. First of all, like any child, they would probably just get attached to anyone who gave them attention so early in life. So it's very believable that Hollow mistook the Pale King's interest in them as love or affection, when in reality, he was just trying to mold them into the perfect weapon against his enemy. It would also make sense that Hollow tried so hard at its assigned duty because it wanted to make its father proud. And, as we know from the Collector again, void creatures can come to love things. Even if it is a twisted sense of love, the Collector does love the grubs, again, even if it's for some odd or wrong reason. So, is it really that hard to believe that Hollow could come to love the thing it saw as its father? From Hollow's perspective, not only did the Pale King save them from the dark abyss they would have been trapped within, the Pale King gave them a purpose, a reason to belong, a duty. something that they could live for. Even if the Pale King did accurately describe what Hollow's duty would be to it, it is very much possible that they didn't really understand what they were signing up for. That they were even signing up for anything, considering that if they probably showed too many obvious signs of weakness, they would have just been thrown back down into the abyss. Skipping ahead a little bit, we know in reality, the one thing that really could put down the Radiance for good was a void-based creature, but not a mindless one. By the time of the Dream No More ending, Ghost has come to terms with its own past and regrets, and is choosing to stop the light, not out of a sense of obligation, but a more honorable sense of duty and wanting to do what's right for the kingdom and their siblings. So maybe, in an alternate universe, where Hollow was allowed to embrace the void within itself, maybe they could have done more. But again, that's just speculation. Another tragedy is that you can't even try to come up with any sort of happy ending to this scenario, because even if the Pale King and White Lady tried to raise the vessels as children and gave them love, they still had to deal with the Radiance somehow. They were all doomed from the start. There never was any hope. Once Hollow was raised and trained, and the Dreamers were laid to rest, they were dubbed the Hollow Knight and locked away in the deepest parts of the Black Egg Temple, once the Radiance was sealed within them. From there, Hollow tried, and ultimately failed, to contain the Radiance, and the infection began to spread again. Now the White Lady chalks this up to the idea that Hollow's purity was incorrectly judged, and generally comes across like she believes Hollow failed due to getting attached to their father. Slightly off topic. Obviously most people point out how terrible of a person the Pale King is, but I feel like people give the White Lady a little too much slack. Even if the plan wasn't her idea, she was fully fine with helping her husband fulfill said plan, and she never even tried to stop him. She's also just really condescending to us, but I might be reading too much into things. At least the Pale King seemed to have eventually realized the vessels were more sentient than he thought, and felt great shame over what he did. Meanwhile, the White Lady's kinda just a prick. Anyways, I'd like to bring up a line of dialogue from the White Lady, where she mentions the Radiance has been sealed within the Hollow Knight for ages. Now, taking the word ages literally, that means the Hollow Knight has been locked up in that temple for at least a century. Also, to back this idea up, assuming the normal bugs of Hallownest live about as long as regular people do, and Elderbug states the stag stations were closed before he was alive, and if he's around 70 to 80, that lines up pretty well with it being around a century at the very least. Now, imagine being locked in an empty room, strung up by chains, trying to subdue an angry deity within your very being, all while knowing you will fail. To elaborate, I do think Hollow knew they wouldn't succeed at their goal, but they tried their best anyways. While the Hollow Knight does have cut Dreamnail dialogue, its pure vessel form does as well. And I doubt Team Cherry would have gone to the effort of writing those lines of code into the game once they had established this was how they were handling the character. Adding on to that, the fact that Team Cherry denies those lines were even in the game at all, they have gone on record saying they never added lines of code into the game for that, even though they do exist in the original version. It just makes me think that maybe these specific lines might be canon. We just aren't allowed to see them in normal gameplay. Do not think. Do not speak. Do not hope. Do not. These are the cut and removed lines of Dreamnail dialogue from the pure vessel. This is what solidifies my opinion that Hollow knew they would fail. They knew they weren't empty in the way their father assumed and wanted, but they tried regardless. Maybe it was done in an intention to save their siblings from further suffering. Maybe they just wanted to prove their father they weren't a failure. Maybe it was pride. Regardless, Hollow put themselves through living hell, with no hope of salvation. They knew this wasn't ever going to end in any way that was going to be good for them, but they kept trying anyways. We see in the opening cutscene that Hollow was able to slow the spread of the infection for some time, but eventually, the Radiance began to break free once more. We can see that even just attempting to contain the Radiance has done a number on their body. Hollow's shell is cracked, and even more brutally, they've lost an arm. But even still, Hollow still fights. By the time Ghost re-enters Hallownest, destroys the seals, and enters the temple, we can see the infection is very much heavily leaking from Hollow. Yet, once released, it still fights us, just as it was taught to do. I'd also like to bring up that the pure vessel screams without any noise, quite literally suffering in silence, while the Hollow Knight has the radiance scream through them. Obviously, everyone knows that this fight with Hollow gets more depressing as it progresses, but I'd like to break it down a little bit. In the first phase, this is purely Hollow trying to fend us off. It's impossible to say if they recognize us, but they probably assume that if they failed, there's no way a little vessel like Ghost can do any better. You can tell it's only Hollow because they're using the moves from the pure vessel fight. They don't use soul-based attacks, but from a lore perspective, I just think it's because they can't focus due to. By the second phase, Hollow begins to try weaponizing the buildup of infection within themselves by aiming the leaking globs of infection at Ghost, and blasting pillars of infected fire from the ground. At this point in the fight, I think Hollow is still mostly in control of themselves. This is more secondary evidence, but I think that part of the reason why the second half of Sealed Vessel doesn't start until Phase 3 is because Hollow is still trying, and still fighting. But by Phase 3, the music switches, and Hollow begins to stab itself. People have argued if this is Hollow trying to end their own life, or if it's because the radiance is trying to break free. Personally, I think it's Hollow doing this because of the two other moves that are added in this phase involve Hollow almost being thrown around and manipulated by the infection within. So I think this is Hollow using what little control it has left to try to end the suffering. I also think that part of the story the music is trying to convey is that in the first half of the battle, Hollow is trying to keep fighting and trying to complete its duty, no matter how pointless that struggle may be. But by the second phase, you can understand that Hollow has lost all hope. They just want their pain and suffering to end at this point. Maybe they don't care if Ghost can handle the infection at this point. They just want to stop. I'd also like to point out that most of the attacks that involve the infection look incredibly painful. You can see the infection within Hollow bloating and almost bursting out of its body, as if everything in its whole being is doing its best to contain the plague. The infection that swept through Hallownest long ago. They say the harder you struggled against it, the more it consumed you. If that quote from the hunter is true, that does not bode well for Hollow. Keep in mind that the Radiance might be a teensy bit angry at the Pale King for trying to kill her. Again. So, keeping in mind that her essence is literally trapped within Hollow, she's probably not very nice to them. Even bugs that willingly took in the infection have always been driven mad and they had their bodies mangled to some extent. So I'd imagine Hollow being as stubborn as they were probably hurt them more in the end. Once you reach the final phase of the fight, you can tell how much the battle has taken its toll on Hollow. Hollow is getting attacked both internally and externally, and eventually, their body gives out. They clutch their chest with their remaining arm as Ghost pulls the infection from them, eventually completing annihilating Hollow in the process. Even though Hollow was cared for the most out of all their siblings, they unfortunately suffered the worst fate of them all. Thankfully, that ending is not the only one. First off, something I'd like to point out is that I think Ghost and Hollow both have a semi-unique amount of identity and sentience. Obviously, Ghost has a strong enough will to command the entire void with the help of the distorted King Soul, but I'd like to argue that Hollow is to some extent as well. While it isn't very clear if they can act independently of the Void Heart's will in the Dream No More ending, it is made very clear that they can in the Embrace the Void ending. First of all, in the Dream No More ending, we don't see Hollow's shade until the very end of the fight. My interpretation is that Hollow regains some hope as Ghost fights the Radiance. At this point, maybe Hollow realizes that while they failed to be the sole savior of Hallownest, that doesn't mean they can't still help. So they use the superior strength of their more developed shade to rip open the Radiance, allowing Ghost to put her down. And I think that's what's important here. Hollow probably had it drilled into them that they were supposed to be able to save the kingdom by themselves. So I think in a way, the moment where they expose the Radiance for their sibling to finish off is meant to be a parallel and redemption of the moment when they left Ghost behind to fall. They finally accept that they're family. Presumably, after the battle is over, the spirits of Ghost and Hollow both descend back into the void, finally able to rest. I like to think that if any of the other siblings had any ill will towards Hollow, all was forgiven by then. Obviously, the final ending to talk about here is Embrace the Void. At the end of the fourth Pantheon, there is a cutscene where all the vessels seem to unite to meet the call of the Radiance. But while Ghost seems to join the sea as its leader at the end of Pantheon 5, Hollow seems to be left behind. Again, I think this is due to the fact that Hollow had developed a stronger individual will over its lifetime. And we can tell that this isn't just an independent part of Bill, because even if Bill gets flowered, they are still able to act and confront Hornet outside the Temple of the Black Egg. And we know things like this can happen, because the Collector doesn't become passive once we gain the Void Heart. It's still aggressive as ever, because it has its own will. So in the end, we don't really know exactly what happened to Hollow and their siblings, but we do know how things began. Hollow was set up for failure by a bunch of bugs playing God. Keep in mind that only higher beings really refer to themselves as gods officially, while in-universe they're only known as higher beings. Yes, they may exist above other bugs, but they are far from infallible. Hollow probably thought they were lucky once they reached the top of the Abyss Chasm, but as I said earlier, they were definitely the most unlucky. Ultimately, at the end of his life, the Pale King died ashamed, scared, and ultimately wrong about his creations. The vessels never needed to be hollow, because they never could be. As sappy as it sounds, just accepting themselves and their siblings were all they needed in the end to defeat the Radiance. Hollow is one of my favorite characters, if not my favorite character, in all of fiction. I'm not exactly sure how to put my exact thoughts into words, but I'll try regardless. Just the idea that Hollow kept trying even in a world that didn't care about them and was actively beating them down, the fact that they kept fighting for what they thought they needed to do, it's kind of inspiring to me in a silly way, I guess. I go back and forth on if I want the Embrace the Void ending cliffhanger to be followed up on, because on one hand, if it's never followed up on, I feel like I'm very content with Hollow's fate in the Dream No More ending. I feel like it's a nice, satisfying end to their character. But with Godmaster, in that ending, I get a potential to see more of one of my favorite characters, hopefully, if SILKSONG ever comes out, and assuming SILKSONG will follow up on those endings. Even if Hollow ultimately failed the goal they were assigned by the Pale King, they were really a true knight of Hallownest. So, rest in peace, Hollow. May your shade find rest. What makes something alive and sentient is a question that philosophers have been asking for a very long time, and it's a question that I am definitely not going to be able to answer in a silly YouTube video. But I believe that Ghost, Hollow, and all of their siblings were ultimately alive in some shape, way, or form. They had wants, they had regrets, they had will, and they could love. So, if that doesn't make something alive, what will? I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it wasn't too short or anything. I'm a bit worried about that, because sometimes I worry I have all this, stuff written down, and I feel like it should be longer than it is, but it doesn't. I don't think that really matters as much. The Hollow Knight is one of my favorite characters, and I wanted to make a more in-depth video about them. Yes, I did make a video on the vessels as a whole, but I kind of just wanted to talk a little bit more about it, even if I'm reiterating some similar points, so I apologize for covering similar ground. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe and maybe share the video with a friend. If you're feeling extra generous, maybe consider supporting me on Patreon if you really like these videos so I can continue to make bigger and better videos in the future. All that being said, thank you once again for watching. Please have a good day, and good night, or good morning, whatever time this video comes out, I'm not sure.